What's up, everybody? We are back. Corey used Bloody History. We're on fire this week. Knocked out 2 shows yesterday. I'm trying to break it up a little bit because we're going to be getting back into New Orleans and Lauren Hall and these fucking mercenaries, because you have to understand the right-wing landscape in this country to understand how it wasn't really the right-wingers behind this thing, right? It was not this network of right-wing fucking lunatics back in the 60s that consisted of the Minutemen and the John Birch Society and all of these fucking weirdo right-wing groups. But seeing what's going on today in America, how we're being completely inundated with communism and fucking cultural Marxism, when you look back to the McCarthyism of the 50s and 60s, it's like, oh my God, where's that today, right? Where is that today? Where is McCarthy today? If I'd have known growing up what I know now, God damn, I'd be a very different person. But what we're going to do today, we're going to have some fun today. We're going to take today's going to be a little like a preview, because this person that we're going to talk about today needs a much deeper dive. I did the deeper dive on him years ago, but I never really finalized any of my research or wrote it up. It was more of a odd fascination. But the more I understand the events in Dealey Plaza, the more the role of Reuben Goldstein and Honest Joe's pawn shop, and the role that they played in the assassination becomes very obvious at this point. So I'm going to read through a bunch of news articles. Actually, I'm going to read some forums, too. I usually don't read some forums, but this one's 20 years ago. Alt.conspiracy.jfk newsgroup archive. Because there's some good information here. And we are going to get to it. But Honest Joe, Reuben Goldstein, most certainly played a role in the assassination, possibly delivering weapons, possibly delivering shooters, but definitely having some sort of weird role in the assassination, which hopefully as we go through this, we'll come to understand a little bit better. So this first post I'm going to read is Honest Joe's Pawn Shop Truck. It's from the alt.conspiracy.jfk newsgroup archive, and this was posted by Vern Pascal, and it says, from Encyclopedia of the JFK Assassination by Michael Benson. Joe Goldstein was another guy said to be best friends with Jack Ruby. Goldstein was known as a Dallas extrovert and eccentric who advertised himself as Honest Joe Goldstein, the Lone Ranger, L-O-A-N. Goldstein owned a gaudily painted Edsel with a plugged .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the top that, according to the Secret Service agent Forrest Sorrells, was parked outside the Dallas police station on Commerce Street during the early evening of November 23rd. Reporter Tony Zoppi, who watched the motorcade on Main Street, recalls, "We all said, 'Here comes the parade,' and it was Honest Joe in his station wagon about 2 minutes before the parade." A.J. Milliken, an assassination witness, told sheriff's deputies he saw a truck from Honest Joe's pawn shop parked close to the Texas School Book Depository, then drive off 5 to 10 minutes before the assassination. In my next post, I will highlight Milliken, who heard a total of 8 shots from 2 different directions. Assassination witness Jean Hill told Dallas reporter Jim Mars that before the assassination, she had seen a van with writing on the side that said Uncle Joe's pawn shop. The van drove past police lines and down the service road in front of the Texas School Book Depository and behind the pergola. Assassination witness Marilyn Willis told FBI Special Agent A. Raymond Switzer on June 19, 1964, that 30 seconds Before the parade, there was an old loan truck called Honest Joe. He was a pawn shop operator, and his old black car was painted with all kinds of signs, and it had a great big gun mounted on top of that car. And he drove up Houston towards the depository and pulled in behind somewhere back there and turned around and came back. If the driver were parked behind the pergola during the shooting, he would have been a witness not only to the assassination but to any suspicious activity behind the fence in the car lot and railroad yard area. Why wasn't he questioned, and what about him being parked outside the police station the night before Lee Harvey Oswald's murder by his friend Jack Ruby? More coincidences? Vern. And then Vern continues. This is Vern Pascal. A.J. Milliken was standing on the north side of Ellum, midway between Houston and the Triple Underpass at the time of the assassination. As mentioned in the above post, he saw Honest Joe's pawn shop truck parked close to the TSBD shortly before the shooting. According to Milliken, just after the president's car passed, I heard 3 shots from up towards Ellum right by the TSBD, and then immediately I heard 2 more shots come from the arcade between the TSBD and the underpass. Then 3 more shots came from the same direction, only sounded further back. It sounded like approximately a .45 automatic or a high-powered rifle. So Milliken heard a total of 8 shots, and from 3 different locations. First volley from the right by the TSBD, but not necessarily from the building itself. The second volley from the arcade or pergola area, possibly including the fence and the knoll. And the third burst of gunfire from further back than the pergola grassy knoll area. Could this be the junction between the underpass and the fence, along long thought to be a sniper location? Can all this simply be attributed to mere echoes, or do some people have a very acute sense of hearing, allowing them to differentiate keenly the sounds coming from different directions? Perhaps the 3 synchronized volleys he heard were simply reduced to only 3 shots by most ear witnesses. Anyway, it's interesting to note that Homer McMahon at the Kodak lab in Rochester said that on the Z film, which he watched about 10 times, there was evidence of 6 to 8 shots. And keep in mind that the crime scene, the limo, was whisked out of town, so we'll never know what evidence has been lost to the number of bullets which may have been left their mark on the car. Homer McMahon surely must give one doubts that only 3 shots were fired that day. A.J. Milliken was never questioned by either the Warren Commission or the HSCA. Par for the course. Vern. Then he writes, let's enumerate the coincidences. 1, the owner of the panel truck, it's actually Reuben Goldstein, not Joe Goldstein, was a good friend of Jack Ruby. 2, the truck was seen by several witnesses just minutes before the assassination in the near vicinity of the TSBD and behind the pergola. It was parked near the Dallas police station where Lee Harvey Oswald was being held the night of the 23rd. Neither the DPD, nor the FBI, nor the Secret Service, nor the Warren Commission, nor the HSCA were interested in what the driver of this truck had to say about all this. This particular truck could hardly be missed with a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on its top. Only in Texas, I guess. Vern. Then there's a reply by Steve Thomas. He goes, there's another one too. Speaking of the morning of the 24th, just prior to Oswald's transfer, Forrest Sorrells told the Warren Commission, quote, and then he was taken out, and that time, I recall it, Inspector Kelly and I left and went up to, down the hall to the executive office area of the police department and to the office of Deputy Chief Batchelor, and we remained in that vicinity. I looked out the window and saw the people across the street on Commerce Street. People were waiting there, and I saw an individual that I know by the name of Ruby Goldstein, who is known as Honest Joe, that has a second-hand tool and pawn shop down on Elm Street. And everyone around there knows him. He was leaning on the car, looking in the direction of the ramp there at the police station. Vern then says, thanks, Steve. For this most interesting addition, the coincidence is that Goldstein himself was seen on Commerce Street near the police station by Forrest Sorrells the morning of the Lee Harvey Oswald transfer. Looking in the direction of the infamous ramp, I sure wish someone had questioned the guy somewhere down the line, but I suppose he's pawned his way into heaven by now. Vern. And then another response by O.H. Lee. It says, hey, Vern, the guy had a .50 caliber plugged machine gun mounted on top of his truck. Ha ha. The lone nutters get bent out of shape about Oswald carrying a handgun into a theater. Only in Texas, indeed, sir. Regards, Gary. I like these old forums sometimes. Sometimes you can read these and see that people are having a genuine conversation. But if you were to actually inject some real answers in here, they probably would reject you like they do today. the modern day forums for the Kennedy researchers are really just about a bunch of jerk offs who've never solved shit in 50 fucking years, patting each other on the back for what I don't know. Who the fuck knows? All right. Martin Shackelford says, Honest Joe's truck was behind the limousine, hardly a source for the throat shot, nor was the throat shot of .50 caliber. The wound is the same appearance as the back wound when reconstructed. Martin Shackelford again says, I have learned that a home movie shot by Pat Sanders, among those in the collection of the 6th Floor Museum in Dallas, includes 2 views of Honest Joe's sedan ahead of the motorcade. Nothing at all on top of the car. Honest Joe was prominent on the sides, and over the rear window was a large JFK sign. Martin. Vern Pascal then says, he quotes Martin Shackelford here that says, Honest Joe's truck was behind the limo. And he says, Martin, I received an email from Gary Mack who says that in an unidentified film, Pat Roberts, taken on Maine, Honest Joe's sedan was ahead of JFK by about a minute. Gary describes the color of his sedan as being white with light blue side panels. That in the film he recognized Goldstein behind the wheel, and that there definitely was not a machine gun or anything else on the top. The description hardly jibes with that of a vehicle reported by the DP witnesses. The only color provided in Dealey by Miss Willis is black, which could hardly be confused with white with blue side panels. As for the machine gun, maybe it was on the pawn shop side and not atop the vehicle at all. And the witnesses are just plain confused on this point. Apparently, this is one of those stories that goes nowhere and has no resolution without more witness corroboration. But I'm still intrigued by its being spotted outside the police station by the night of the 23rd by Forrest Sorrells. Yeah, so that's pretty interesting stuff. And then it says here, in one site I was at going into Google, I found one spot on the menu for Honest Joe Goldstein. It was under Cuban Information Archives, Research Directory 2001 edition, Honest Joe Goldstein 151. I didn't know how to access it, so there's some information if anyone wants to go and try and track that down. Let me see. Here's a response from Kurt Jester. Vern, it might not be much, but here's an example of Forrest Sorrells' testimony that has a little info. And what happened, he's being questioned, Sorrells is. And what happened, and he's being questioned by someone named Stern, which is interesting. And then what happened? Mr. Sorrells, he was told that they were going to move him to the county jail, and he requested that he be permitted to get a shirt out of his the clothes that he had been brought in that belonged to him, because the shirt he was wearing at the time he had been apprehended was taken apparently for laboratory examination. And so Captain Fritz sent and got his clothes, and as I recall, he selected a dark-colored kind of sweater-type shirt, as I recall it. And then he was taken out, and at the time, as I recall it, Inspector Kelly and I left and went up up, down the hall to the executive office area of the police department and to the office of Deputy Chief Batchelor, and we remained in that vicinity. I looked out the window and saw the people across the street on Commerce Street. People were waiting there, and I saw an individual that I know by the name of Ruby Goldstein, who was known as Honest Joe, that has a secondhand tool and pawn shop down on Elm Street, and everyone around there knows him. He was leaning on the car, looking over in the direction of the ramp at the police station, and we were just there waiting around there. And for a few minutes, I was talking to one of the police officers that was on duty in the area, and he made the remark, talking about open windows, I see one open across the street over there, at that building across the street. I looked over there. I didn't see any activity at the window, and we had walked out in the reception area of the executive office of the chief of police there when this same police officer said that he just heard that Oswald had got shot in the stomach in the basement by Jack Rubin, as I understood it at the time, Rubin, who was supposed to run a nightclub. Also, as a side note about the Oswald arrest attire, I didn't know he had changed and had gotten another piece of clothing from home via Fritz. So the photos I had been viewing to try to determine what he could have been wearing at arrest might be completely off. Now I wonder when Oswald got his change of clothes. Interesting. All right, Vern Pascal then again says, he quotes Martin Shackelford, quote, does anyone believe that there was a truck with a .50 caliber machine gun mounted to its top within plain view of the motorcade? And Vern says, Martin, it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But in the Dallas climate at the time, I'm not so sure. Besides, if the truck were behind the pergola, it wouldn't be in plain view of the motorcade. Recall how inattentive the Secret Service were that day. No mention of the open windows in the Texas School Book Depository, nor of anyone with a gun in the SN window, which in the sniper's nest window, which other bystanders saw. No mention of UM, etc. Aside from the assassination itself and any role the truck may have played in it, I'm intrigued by the fact that this truck, owned by a Ruby friend, was parked near the police station on the night of the 23rd. Also, we may consider that the plugged machine gun may have been removed that day, and witnesses recalled the gun from previously actually seeing only the signage for Honest Joe's. I just don't know, but there should be more witnesses out there somewhere. Vern. And then Martin Shackelford says, you're also forgetting that Honest Joe traveled the motorcade route prior to the motorcade, given the police and crowds along that route. Do you really think he could make the drive with a machine gun affixed to the top? Curtis Jester then chimes in and says, Vern, I see there are 3 witnesses to this Joe's pawnshop truck. I'm sure nobody else was even asked, and I bet there are more out there, especially TSBD employees who would have been there by that extended street along the TSBD. And then there was that Chevy in the parking lot driven by the lady in back of the GK that Roger Craig had stopped and was arresting, but turned it over to another deputy who for some inexplicable reason let her go. I think it would do some good if some memories were jogged on these. I couldn't find anything more on Joe Goldstein at Google, but the only thing related I could come up with is in David Scheim's book, Contract on America, is where George Senator and Eva Grant, Ruby's sister, relate that Joseph Campisi was one of Ruby's closest friends, and then gives a few references. Maybe the references would go into greater detail on Ruby's friends, as this was just a mafia tie-in by Scheim. Real quick, let me comment. One of the vehicles in play here in Dealey Plaza and beyond, which was witnessed at a gas station, somebody saw rifles in the back seat, was a white Pontiac station wagon. And straight from the lips of Ryan Dawson, that was driven that afternoon by George Senator. I haven't taken the time to dig into that in particular, but in this particular context, I believe Ryan was probably correct in telling the truth. Here are the references from page 123 in chapter 9 of his book, and then abbreviating meaning and examples. Okay. So here he just talks about there was 2 main collections referenced in the documents, and one of them refers to JFK microfilm, which refers to files of evidence connected with the investigation of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, Washington, D.C., Microcard Editions 1967. It is a collection of 21 volumes of documents from the Texas Attorney General's investigation of the JFK assassination. A copy is held in the Library of Congress, Rare Book Collection, catalog number E842.9.F47. So this, I think, is very important. If you guys want to dig into and possibly dig up any information on the Texas Attorney General's investigation into the assassination, that seems to be a whole area of investigation that no one ever talks about or has brought to light. Whoever refers to the Texas Attorney General's investigation, right? Nobody. Let's see if we can find some documents on that. All right. Scrolling through this to see if there's anything else here. A couple of witnesses, this is from Walt, a couple of witnesses described Honest Joe's, would you do business at a pawn shop called Honest Joe's, vehicle as an Edsel, and car. A panel truck is not a car. A Ford Motor Company never produced a panel truck in their Edsel line. I'm simply confused about what Honest Joe's vehicle is. Was it a panel truck or was it a car? And then Steve Thomas says, I got an email from Gary Mack. He told me that the 6th Floor Museum has a home movie showing Honest Joe preceding the motorcade by a couple of minutes. He was driving his Edsel, not his truck with the machine gun mounted on top. That's from Steve Thomas. And then he says, P.S. Does anyone know what color Goldstein's panel truck was? Then he replies again, according to the DPD tape transcripts at 2:04 p.m., Unit 47-4A, identified only as Special Services Bureau, radios in and says he needs a wrecker at Cobb Stadium for a suspect's car. According to CE 1974, at 23H885, approximately 2:20 p.m., Unit 474A is dispatched to pick up a, quote, subject on this overpass carrying a rifle, railroad tracks, Cobb Stadium, end quote. 474A was asked if he could see the subject. 474A said no, but that they would go over and get him. At 2:23, Unit 22, Patrolman L.L. Hill was dispatched to go out to Cobb Stadium on the railroad track overpass and meet 474A at the railroad tracks. There was a white male carrying a rifle, 23H886. At 2:26, Unit 562, a wrecker radioed in and said that he was at Cobb Stadium for that suspect's car, 23H887. The dispatcher told the wrecker to wait there, that 474A will, quote, be back in a minute. At 2:27, Unit 52, unknown officer, radioed in and asked if the TC Cobb Stadium was the one on Hines Boulevard overpass, the railroad overpass, or the freeway overpass, and asked which direction the suspect was walking. The dispatcher's response was garbled, but said he didn't know about the direction. 23H887. At 2:28, Patrolman Hill reported that he was with the wrecker at Cobb Stadium at Unit 474A, was ordered to go there. 474A radios in and says, the car that we want picked up is on the parking lot in front of the merchandise mart just north of Cobb Stadium. 22 asks, is it a 1964 Falcon? 474A says, no, it's a red panel truck with writing on the side. License plate 3E9087. At 2:26, Unit 562, a wrecker, radioed in and said that he was at Cobb Stadium, quote, for that suspect's car. The dispatcher told the wrecker to wait there, that 474A will, quote, be back in a minute. There follows a series of transmissions from 474A looking for Deputy Chief M.W. Stevenson and Lieutenant C.C. Wallace. Interesting. Vern Pascal then responds, we may be dealing with two separate vehicles, both owned by Goldstein and both displaying the Honest Joe's logo. As to color, assassination witness Marilyn Willis called the vehicle she saw both an old loan truck and an old black car with a machine gun on top. See my first post in this thread. Forrest Sorrells apparently saw an old, gaudily painted Edsel parked near the police station the night of the 23rd. This is a car, not a truck, and ostensibly is the vehicle with the machine gun mounted on top. Sorrells does not describe the color of this vehicle, but apparently it is the same one seen by Willis just before the assassination. Reporter Tony Zoppi mentions Honest Joe in his station wagon just prior to the motorcade, but did not include the machine gun in his brief description. Maybe because this strange sight was a Dallas fixture. Assassination witness A.J. Milliken mentions Honest Joe's truck, but again, not the gun on top. I suppose that in some people's minds, a station wagon, especially a large one, might be confused with a truck, especially a panel truck. So the only make offered by any of the witnesses, one, is an Edsel, and the only color, one witness, is black. Speaking of suspicious trucks, we have Julia Ann Mercer's account of a green Ford pickup, Jack Ruby's pickup, right? Shortly before 11 a.m. on the 22nd, parked near the grassy knoll with two occupants, the thinner of whom carried what looked like a gun case toward the fence, and the driver, who she later identified as Jack Ruby, or a dead ringer, now who owned a green Ford pickup. Well, I can tell you that the green Ford pickup ended up in the hands of Donald Robert Underwood, a good friend of Jack Valenti's, after the assassination. How do I know this? Because his son or someone related to him wrote articles about it and published it on the fucking internet. Duh. So, moving on. I was just doing some research. In some of Richard Bartholomew's 1994 updated version of some Fair Play article that I reached online in the Birds, Planes, and an Automobile section from Google, and it had a snippet on Honest Joe and AM Printing. It's as potential tie-in to the topic in case someone has access or can research the cited source and article. Quoted paragraph from the article by R. Bartholomew. If Jack is Jack Dulles, the adjunct UT professor and expert on Brazil, this gets quite interesting considering Greg Doyle's latest findings on Honest Joe from the Fourth Decade, Volume 1, Number 5, July 94, page 13 to 16. I accept, based on John Franklin Elrod and other evidence, that Ruby and Oswald were involved in gun running together. Bullshit. I don't buy that for a split second. Given that, it is not a stretch to accept a Payne-Ruby link through Oswald. There are also the likely Payne-Ruby links through her friend Mamontov and Ruby's buddy Pereira, both of Magnolia Laboratories. Now we learn from Doyle that Julius Sheps, associate and financier of Ruby's closest friends, was friendly with Benjamin H. Stevens, one of the organizers of Magnolia Oil, a director of Standard Oil, and an advisor to Harold Ikes, FDR's Interior Secretary. There are several Ruby Dulles connections suggested by this. All right, so that's a good foundation on why we're looking into Honest Joe and what the hell was he doing around the book depository. And basically from reading on this, I'm kind of coming to the conclusion that there were two people driving Honest Joe's vehicles that day. Honest Joe and, as we'll see coming up, a younger, thinner, tall guy, right? So, but here we go. Some more background information on Honest Joe from geocaching.com. Honest Joe's, and then it says, nobody outside his family knew his real name. Dallas knew him as Honest Joe. For nearly 3 decades, Honest Joe's pawn shop was one of the central hubs of activity in Deep Ellum. He sold everything from gold watches to prosthetic limbs to automatic weapons. His 2-story building was covered in hand-painted signs and hubcaps. Or was it? It was covered in signage and hubcaps, but as for the 2-story part, well, that's another story. Reuben Goldstein moved from New York to Dallas in 1931 to join his 2 older brothers who had already set up shops in Deep Ellum. One of the common Jewish businesses of the day was the pawn shop, and Deep Ellum already had more than its share. But maybe it had room for one more, especially if it was run by an ambitious marketer extraordinaire. Enter Honest Joe. With a wave of his hand and a newly crafted wooden sign, Reuben Goldstein had become Honest Joe. The sign actually read, Honest Joe, Lone Ranger. Loan. As the story goes, a skeptical lady was weighing the integrity of the place when a regular customer, Little Jimmy, chimed in, "Don't worry, lady. This is Honest Joe." He eventually attracted customers like Sammy Davis Jr. and other Hollywood actors, the Dallas mayor, and many Dallas locals. Even Jack Ruby of Lee Harvey Oswald fame bought items for his carousel club here, including tables, which were eventually repossessed since Jack apparently had no intention of ever paying for them. Joe's marketing prowess was legendary. Having his storefront totally covered in signs wasn't enough. He also bought an old Edsel and painted large Honest Joe signs on each side, then mounted a very large decommissioned machine gun on the roof. Not only did he drive this around town, but on November 22nd, 1963, when he saw the crowd downtown for President Kennedy's motorcade, he got the spur-of-the-moment idea. People were lined up along downtown streets and traffic down Main Street had been stopped, but Joe found a way. Minutes later, there was Joe on a long, slow drive through downtown, machine gun and all. He was eventually pulled over, questioned by the FBI, and escorted off Main Street. There are several photos of what is believed to be his car behind the fence just behind the grassy knoll, which of course has driven many conspiracy theorists crazy for years. He was even mentioned in the Warren Report for these antics. Interesting stuff there. Nobody else seems to know that he was pulled over and questioned by the FBI. If they're referring to it that day, that is. In another strange twist to the story, Honest Joe aided the Warren Commission's investigation by providing them replicas of the gun used in the Kennedy shooting. 2 years later, after Jack Ruby died in prison of lung cancer, Honest Joe also found himself as one of the appraisers of Jack Ruby's estate. Much earlier in his career than the Kennedy events, a customer asked him, "What do I have to do to get $20? Give you my right arm?" As he placed his prosthetic arm on the counter. Actually, Honest Joe claimed he was helping the man out who was out of work and out of money and would redeem the arm when he was back to work. Honest Joe's favorite sign at his shop displayed his personal motto, YCDBSOYA. You can't do business sitting on your Afghanistan. His shop was always among the busiest places in Deep Ellum, with both shoppers and loiterers hanging around. in the one area of town that blended cultures, racial and religious, with barbecue joints and delis side by side. One day, a customer nicknamed Hook, who had lost both of his arms, was arrested for pickpocketing. Honest Joe helped him get off the, quote, hook by testifying that both of his prosthetic arms were in hock at the time the crime was committed. All right, moving on. From the outside of Honest Joe's, the building has always looked like an ordinary two-story brick building. The rumors for years had been a little bit different. During Prohibition, it was rumored that there was actually a third story in the building that functioned as a speakeasy, accessible by a staircase in the rear of the building. The story went in that early 1930s. The Dallas police raided the place and watched patrons of the bar scatter. The police then bricked up the entrance, so the story went. The question was any of this true? From the front, sides, and back, it looked like a typical two-story building. Fast forward to the 1960s, and the city of Dallas began to elevate the section of I-75 right next to Honest Joe's. This project required unroofing part of Honest Joe's. As 3 generations of Goldsteins looked on, they watched a demolition crew tear down what was believed to be the brick barrier erected by the Dallas police. As the wall came down, what did they see? They found the very well-preserved remains of a white and black tiled speakeasy that looked as if they had stepped back in time and the raid had just occurred. There were empty beer bottles and wine glasses scattered about along the paper betting slips, and the list of phone numbers taped to a post. The bar was still there, and even a quiet jukebox sat in the corner, full of vintage records and coins. The neighborhood declined considerably through the 1960s. Many of the shops had closed and others were just hanging on. Honest Joe passed away in 1972, and his wife, Bess, kept the store open until 1985. Honest Joe and his wife would be proud to find that one of their granddaughters has renovated the original building and started a very successful business that helps encourage and support those who want to live in and around Deep Ellum, thus helping the revitalization of this area. Inside the building, right next to the front desk, hangs a picture of Honest Joe's storefront circa 1959. For those who make it up to the 3rd floor, there is an archway surrounded by red bricks. This is the last vestige of the speakeasy above Honest Joe's. Addendum. Interestingly, down the street from Honest Joe's was Rocky's pawn shop, owned by his older brother, Isaac Goldstein. On October 13th, 1980, John Hinckley Jr. went to Rocky's and purchased the cheap handgun that he used in his assassination attempt of President Ronald Reagan on March 30th, 1981. Rocky's sold more guns than most pawn shops, in part due to Isaac's clever marketing, in which he advertised his business as both pawn shop and as Rocky's police equipment, both on the building signage and separate yellow page ads. The sign above his front entrance, which read "Guns don't cause crime any more than flies cause garbage," didn't stop him or his family members from getting numerous threats, including death threats after the Reagan assault. The local businessmen all supported Isaac, insisting that he had done nothing wrong. In fact, the president of the Texas Pawnbrokers Association said people that call up Rocky and threaten him are just as kooky as the guy who shot the president. The gun just as easily could have been from my pawn shop. All right, we're about to wrap this up. There's a couple extra little paragraphs thrown in here. A bit more trivia for those interested. Honest Joe's son-in-law worked as the junior partner in a 2-man law firm that represented Jack Ruby's personal and business issues. They helped structure several of his clubs to help creatively work around the laws regarding exotic dancing and alcohol sales. Ruby also gave them the handgun he used to shoot and kill Lee Harvey Oswald. It remained in their safe deposit box until the FBI illegally obtained its custody throughout protracted court proceedings. They also recommended the legal counsel that represented him in his criminal case for shooting Oswald. Interesting stuff, huh? All right. So here we have another, looks like a local Dallas forum talking about Honest Joe's pawn shop, and I wanted to read some of this stuff. All right, so posted by Roy. I was talking to a former Dallas resident who moved to Oklahoma City in '74. He mentioned Honest Joe's pawn shop and asked if it was still in business. I informed him that the pawn shop, which consisted on several different buildings located on the south side of Elm Street, been taken over by the Deep Ellum. He remembered a car that Honest Joe drove that had a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the hood and advertising all over it. I remembered the pawn shop, but I don't remember the vehicle he described. I was working the 11 to 7 a.m. shift in this period, and I missed a lot, I guess. I seem to recall that John Hinckley purchased the pistol with which he would wound President Reagan, Press Secretary James Brady, and several law enforcement personnel at Honest Joe's pawn shop. That woke up, and this is a reply from Fred Ragsdale. That woke up an old memory, Roy. When I was about 12 or 13, about once a month, 3 or 4 of us boys would ride the streetcar from Oak Cliff to downtown. We'd always make our way to Deep Ellum and spend a couple hours in Honest Joe's and the other pawn shops in the area. We were fascinated with all the guns, watches, rings, knives, and guitars, as well as all the oddball things that could be found in those shops. Teresa Jordan then says, it woke up memories for me too, Fred. When I was in my mid-teens, I spent time down at Honest Joe's. Of course, Mom didn't know that, or I never could have gone there, but it was a fascinating place. There are some places in life that are just great to spend time, kind of like Elliot's Hardware. I could spend a day in that hardware store. Gerald Harrison says, Roy, Honest Joe's pawn shop was a large, overgrown junkyard that called itself a pawn shop located not far from the central fire station. My dad spent the last 20 years of his life as a dispatcher at that fire station. He died in 1966. I visited the fire station and Honest Joe's many times in my youth. While I don't have incontrovertible citations at my fingertips, my recollection is that a proper investigation of the facts will show you have the wrong pawn shop for the Hinckley gun source. As I recall, the Hinckley gun and the Ruby gun were both purchased from the same shop a few blocks from Honest Joe's. The original name of the shop was Ruby's Pawn Shop when Jack bought his gun there. The owner was so irate with Jack Ruby that he changed the name of his shop at the same location to Rocky's Pawn Shop, where Hinckley made his purchase. Anyone else remember the facts this way? Am I close? I don't believe that's correct, because if I'm not mistaken, the fucking gun that Jack Ruby used was given to him by Joe Cody. So... But then again, Jack Ruby was seen in a hardware store or some kind of store down in Galveston that Saturday after the assassination, either buying or selling a gun. So, who the fuck knows? That I'll have to dig into a little further. I still haven't figured out a lot of Jack Ruby's activities in Galveston. All right, so Gerald Harris says, now it comes to me, the name of the pawn shop operator was Ruby Goldstein, who changed his name to Rocky Goldstein. See, these guys are they're trying to remember facts from their history, but they're getting it wrong. Rocky Goldstein was Reuben's brother. He didn't change his name, right? So I love this, because this is people who are actually there trying to recall stuff, who don't give a fuck about the assassination, right? A credible source on the Goldsteins and various other pawnbrokers and pawn shops is Alan B. Governors and J.F. Breakfield's Deep Ellum and Central Track, published 1998 by the University of North Texas Press. It includes details and or photos of Uncle Sam's Pawn Shop, Honest Joe's Pawn Shop, Dave's Pawn Shop, Day and Night Pawn Shop, and King Edward Pawn Shop, a shrine to Honest Joe's established by son Eddie, East Grand, and others. As I recall, Dave Goldstein, Isaac, and Rocky Goldstein, and Reuben, Honest Joe, were brothers. There are pics of a couple of machine guns, but not mounted on the car. Of this, it's stated a gaudy station wagon parked outside the store, Honest Joe's, featured a non-functional machine gun. Joe Cody recalled that when things got slow, Honest Joe would drive the wagon downtown, park it illegally near the courthouse, and stage a shouting match with whatever hapless officer showed up to ticket the vehicle. Anything for publicity. There are references to the John Hinckley gun, the association with Jack Ruby, but not the Ruby gun. The book is still on shelves in major bookstores and can be ordered. It's packed with history, details, and first-person accounts and rare photographs. I highly recommend it. That's fascinating. That's fascinating. I want that book. And then Fred Ragsdale says, a really informative posting. I think you probably named all the Deep Ellum pawn shops. I browsed when I was a kid, when it was still the real Deep Ellum, with food joints and all that were so good. Good info about the book also. If I ever get off my duff, I'm going to do some more research using postings like yours and many others here to guide me to some resources. Clyde Howard then says, I have a vague recollection that Jack Ruby bought the Snubby, the cult detective special he used to do Lee Harvey Oswald, from Ray's Hardware or Singleton rather than a pawn shop, but I'd sure hate to have to put any serious money on that. Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure he got the gun from Joe Cody. And then Steve Cunningham says, I recall many Saturdays going through the Deep Ellum pawn shops. I saw the station wagon with the machine gun mounted on it many times. It was amazing what they had in those shops. Wooden legs, brass knuckles, caskets. Anything that could be sold was there. Depending on the traffic, they would run me out after a while. And no, my parents never knew I'd been there. God, that's fucking great. See, I wish I could have grown up in a time that had some real seasoning, some real, like, raw culture. God. All right, let's move on to this article. It's from the Dallas Morning News. Where one man's trash became another man's treasure, pawn shops lined Elm Street in Deep Ellum for decades. The stores played an important role in the neighborhood from the 1920s through the 1980s. This is by Megan Hurley. Published April 15th, 2021. This is Dallas Morning News. Watch those bear traps when you walk through here, pawnbroker Reuben Goldstein of Honest Joe's warned Dallas Morning News staff writer Larry Grove in 1964, while he threaded his way through the clutter of a million valuable items that bear a striking resemblance to junk. This scene was common along Elm Street in Deep Ellum from the 1920s through the 1980s. Pawn shops played an important role in Deep Ellum, lending money and selling inexpensive goods, and they were omnipresent. As pawnbroker Eddie Goldstein said in April 92 interview with writer J.F. Brakefield, Deep Ellum in its heyday was a pawn shop, dry goods store, pawn shop, grocery store, pawn shop, shoe store. Much like navigating an Elm Street pawn shop, we dug through our archives to find tokens that tell this Deep Ellum story. In the 1920s and 30s, Uncle Sam's. Many of the early pawnbrokers of Deep Ellum migrated from Eastern Europe and found their way to Dallas, usually through family connections. One was Wolf Willie Soltz, a native of Australia. In the 1920s, he came to Dallas and went into business with Sam Goldberg, the owner of Uncle Sam's pawn shop at 2316 Elm Street. He eventually took over the whole business. In 1924, Dave Goldstein married Dora Abramson, and in 1930, they bought a dry goods store in Deep Ellum. Many people pawned items there during the Great Depression, so the Goldsteins added a pawn shop and phased out the dry goods. Among their customers in the 1930s were Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, who hadn't yet achieved notoriety. Uncle Sam's had its fair share of tragedies. In the 1931, the pawn shop was robbed twice in 3 days. The burglars took a display case containing a Panama hat and 6 caps the first time, and they took a dozen caps, 2 Panama hats, 6 pairs of hose, and a necktie the second time. And in 1932, the pawn shop was wrecked by a 2-alarm fire. Soltis' extended family trickled into Dallas. His nephew Dave Goldstein came from New York to work at Uncle Sam's with him. Isaac Rocky Goldstein, a younger brother of Dave's, moved to Dallas to work at his brother's pawn shop when the stock market crashed and he had to leave his studies as a law student in New York. He went on to work at Clark and Winterman, a relatively upscale pawn shop at 2308 Elm. He eventually opened his own business in Deep Ellum, Rocky's pawn shop. In the early 1980s, John Hinckley Jr. bought the gun he shot President Ronald Reagan with from Rocky's. The shop was known for the sign that hung over the door. Guns don't cause crime any more than flies cause garbage. 1936 to 1972. Honest Joe's. Reuben Goldstein, another brother of Dave's, grew up on Manhattan's Lower East Side. In 1964, he told staff writer Larry Grove, "I always wanted to be a pawn shop man. I remember looking at the shops on Delancey Street. Once he landed in Dallas, his dream came true." In 1931, Goldstein, then 23, moved to Dallas and opened up a pawn shop at 2524 Elm Street. He gained a reputation for being the most honest pawnbroker on the pawn shop line section of Elm. Outside, his store was covered with business signs and mottos. Inside, it was cluttered with pawned items. He told Grove, I've always taken a liking to junk. A lot of this stuff won't ever sell, but it's good to have around. It gives the place a junky atmosphere, don't you think? His shop was packed to the rafters with random items. Bear traps, artificial limbs, fake teeth, and lots of guns. His most pawned items include watches, rings, and other jewelry. He told many a tale about items and their owners. One such story, and now you won't believe this, but it's true. The other guy, name is White, has a cork arm, and he brings it in all the time and gets a sawbuck. Redeems the arm when he gets work. Wired me money from Houston yesterday and said, put my arm on a bus, I got a job. Honest Joe's influence went beyond his pawn shop. After the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963, FBI agent Pat Pinkston came to Goldstein for assistance tracing Lee Harvey Oswald's gun. The pawnbroker provided replicas of the gun used in the shooting, and Pinkston traced the rifle to Klein's Sporting Goods in Chicago. According to Goldstein's obituary, he was even among the people riding in the motorcade on that fateful November day. His name was included in the Warren Commission's report and in William Manchester's Death of a President. He was also one of the appraisers of Jack Ruby's estate. Honest Joe died in September 1972. His wife, Bess, continued operating the pawn shop for a few years until it closed permanently. In the 1980s, then there were none. After Central Expressway cut Deep Ellum off from the rest of downtown, the number of pawn shops in the neighborhood dwindled until there were none. Jack's Pawn Loans closed in 1984, and in 1987, the last pawn shop on Elm Street, Bishop's Preston Jewelry and Loan at 2226 Elm Street, relocated to Oak Lawn. Dave's, Uncle Jake's, Barbershop Brothers, Day and Night, Rocky's, and of course, Honest Joe's today's. These are just the reminders of a different time. The heyday of Deep Ellum. All right. So, I have another article. It's on the Courier of Montgomery County, of all places. Conroe man remembers Kennedy assassination up close by Mae Stevens, November 22nd, 2015. Do you remember where you were when you heard about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy? Les French of Conroe remembers that fateful day quite vividly. He was about 100 feet away from Kennedy's limousine. French and his friend Phil Brown were 14-year-old students at John Hood Junior High School in Dallas, Texas suburb, but had heard about the president coming to town, wanted to see him in person. Brown's father was a deputy sheriff in Dallas County, and gave the boys a ride into town on November 22nd, 1963. Both boys grew up during Eisenhower era, but like John Kennedy, when he was voted in as president of the United States. I was a voracious reader, French said, and I was more interested in news than sports reports in the papers I delivered daily. I knew that people in Dallas were not pro-Kennedy. News reports on the radio that afternoon told a different story. It was quite a spectator. Tremendous welcome KRLD spun on the radio in Dallas. The Dallas Police Department is in full force to prevent any demonstrations of an adverse nature, but the crowd seemed to welcome the Kennedys. Invited guests were waiting at the Dallas Trade Mart for President and Mrs. Kennedy, where he was expected to give a short speech before eating lunch. This tour of Texas had definite political overtones and was seen as bringing together warring factions in the Democrat Party. The boys thought it was strange that the police allowed a station wagon with a machine gun mounted on the hood to travel behind the dignitaries in the parade. Quote, the 57 Ford had a sign painted on the sign reading, Honest Joe's Pawn Shop, with Joe Goldstein driving his car, making it backfire every few minutes just for fun, French said. We also noticed that no Secret Service agents were riding directly on the first car in the parade, the one with the President Kennedy, Governor Connally, and their wives. I learned later that President Kennedy did not want to block the public's view of him. When the boys were running alongside the president's limousine in front of the Texas School Book Depository, they heard loud shouts. They ran across the street because the parade had stopped for a minute. They ran in the direction of the grassy knoll where they thought the shots had come from. The lead car finally accelerated and drove to Parkland Hospital as we watched. I don't know what made us run towards the shots, but we did. French said. 2 policemen were right behind us and pinned us against the concrete bulkhead. They thought we had thrown firecrackers at the parade. One policeman told us to wait right there while they talked to someone else, but they were gone a minute. He turned his head back. Chaos was the rule, and people were running in all directions. I saw a lady fall down on the sidewalk having a major seizure, French said, but no one came to help her. We didn't have cell phones in those days, and it was not as easy to call for help. Les stopped to get a newspaper from a corner newsstand before he got on a bus and went back to school. He got there before school was out for the day and showed the front page of the newspaper to his friends in class. The headline read, "The President Kennedy was dead." I don't know how they got that printed out on the street so fast, but they did. Governor Conley was also shot that day, but recovered from his wounds. Les French went on to attend a military academy in Ponca City, Oklahoma. His mother had died and his father traveled in business, so the family decided he would do well in that school. And that pretty much wraps up that. But that's pretty interesting that he said that he couldn't believe that the Secret Service had allowed a car with a machine gun on it in the motorcade. So I think it's pretty clear that we have both of Honest Joe's vehicles, the van and the Etzel, both at play here, right? All right, one more article, and we're going to get on to some statements. Meet Evelyn Goldstein, the daughter of Deep Ellum's last Jewish pawnbroker. Evelyn, this is by Jessica Turner. Evelyn Goldstein stayed up drinking wine and listening to Miles Davis to write her dad's eloquent obituary for the Jewish Post last year. She called David Goldstein the last of the Deep Ellum Jewish pawnbrokers. "I'm not a writer," she says. "People have tried to write a book on my family so many times that I'm like, I'm going to write this because Dad was everything to me and a lot of people." Her great-uncle was Honest Joe, a.k.a. Reuben Goldstein, whose pawn shop, with its glorious jumble of hand-painted signs, was a fixture of Deep Ellum for generations. Honest Joe grew up in the Lower East Side of Manhattan and dreamed of owning pawn shops like the one lining Delancey Street in the early 20th century. In 1931, he moved to Dallas, where he had relatives in the pawn business, and at age 23 opened Honest Joe's at 2524 Elm Street. Once he was established, his kin started moving here, including his brother Rocky Goldstein. That was Evelyn's grandfather. Rocky's pawn shop was at 2018 Elm Street. Evelyn's dad worked there starting in childhood and later co-owned it with his dad. The place was crammed with stuff, an organizer's nightmare. One of Rocky's signs read, "Stop dropping cigarette butts on the floor. The cockroaches are getting cancer." They did business with wise guys and petty criminals, but also musicians, housewives, and working stiffs. "When I was a kid, I always wanted to be at my dad's shop," Evelyn says. She grew up in Garland and graduated from Dallas Academy in Lake Highlands. David Goldstein worked all the time and never took days off, so Evelyn and her brother Jordan have tons of childhood memories from the shop. "There were gangsters in all their time there," she says. She said there were gangsters there all the time. Guys she knew as East Dallas Louie and Johnny Tomato used to pick her up from school. Rocky put her into business around age 12 with gumball and candy machines. She had several in East Dallas, like at laundromats and Garland Road thrift store, and those drivers would take her around, collect her profits, and refill them. The Goldsteins received national attention for a couple of presidential incidents. Honest Abe helped the FBI with tracing the rifle Lee Harvey Oswald used to assassinate President Kennedy in 1963. The pawnbroker reportedly had ridden in JFK's motorcade, and he is mentioned in the Warren Commission report. In 1981, Rocky Goldstein sold a .22 caliber handgun to Highland Park's own John Hinckley Jr., who used it in an assassination attempt on President Ronald Reagan. Every media outlet in the country wanted to interview him about that. The notoriety he received over it was so intense that they moved Rocky's from Deep Ellum to East Grand about a year later, Evelyn says. She remembers vividly the time when she was 7 years old that the pawn shop on East Grand was held up. "I was put into a back room," she says. "The kind of stuff was very common then." David Goldstein, who was a staunch Republican his whole life, moved the shop to Garland Road at Peavey around 1990. He turned it into a police supply store selling uniforms, holsters, and vests to cop, while his dad also ran a small pawn shop inside the store. The Garland Road store was safer than the 2 previous locations, she said. Evelyn started working there when she was about 15, mostly helping with inventory. In high school, her friends always wanted to hang out there, even when they could have been at the mall or Wet n Wild. The magnetism was in her dad's stories of old Dallas, and he also gave them candy. David Goldstein, who grew up in East Dallas and graduated from Hillcrest High School, practiced painting and music and loved to romance beautiful women. He was married 4 times, and his final marriage to Laura Levy lasted 17 years. He was known as a Jewish matchmaker and even introduced his ex-girlfriends to his buddies. In 1986, he started a club with his 3 best friends, Bernie Schuster, Larry Strauss, and Howie Miles, called the Weiss Guys. Every Thursday night, they would go out. Women weren't involved, and they'd have dinner, Evelyn says. The Weiss Guys grew to include about 200 men, and 40 or 50 would often show up to the dinners. My little brother was working in a restaurant, and he didn't want to wait on them, she says. Separate checks, Diet Cokes, coffees with cream. About once a year, they'd have a big party at the Stoneleigh and invite the wives, she said. After her dad died in May, they held the last Weiss Guys dinner. They invited me and my brother and had us sit at the head of the table, she said. Almost all of them came. It was very touching. Evelyn still has 2 cousins who worked at Rocky's back in the day, but so many of David Goldstein's close friends and family members have died, she says. It's a shame. Nobody wrote that book. She is a witness to the assassination and Honest Joe's vehicle in Dealey Plaza. And so here we go. So she's being interviewed by a Mr. D. The reason for the break was Investigator Max. They just took a break in the interview. The reason for the break was the Investigator Maxwell just showed Mrs. Moore a map of the Dealey Plaza area, and it's marked Appendix Number A. And at the time, Mrs. Moore pointed out to us exactly where she was in relation to the book depository in the Grassy Knoll and the statue on the opposite side of the street in the Grassy Knoll area. Now we can continue from here. And then Mrs. Moore says, "That party fell down. Did you ever see them get up again?" "No, I didn't." "Did anyone go to their aid?" "Yes, the people standing there was gather around." Okay, she's talking about the epileptic Jerry Belknap. "All right, now I talked to Mrs. Van Zant, and she indicated that she saw a car pull into Houston Street somewhere around here." "Yes." "Did you see that car?" "Yes, I did." "Right. What did the car do?" "Well, at the time, Elm Street was a 2-way street. So it came down Elm Street going toward the book depository. It was driving real slow. Now, we couldn't see the car while it was in front of us, but when it came down on the side where we're looking out the side window, you could see this car. It was a black truck, and it had lots of writing on it, and the truck had Jack Ruby and Honest Joe. I remember saying to one of my coworkers, "What in the world is Honest Joe doing out in the middle of the street in a time like this?" "And it also had Jack Ruby on it?" "Yeah, it had Jack Ruby written on there and Honest Joe." And I said, "Well, that must be the same person." I remember thinking to myself, Jack Ruby and Honest Joe must be the same person. And he came down and to the intersection of Elm and Houston Street, and he pulled into the intersection, and he just sit there. I didn't see this person. I just saw a man with a hat on, but I didn't actually see him because I wasn't paying attention to any of that. But I saw a man with a hat on sitting in this truck, and he drove down into the intersection of Houston and Elm Street, and he sit there for maybe 2 minutes, and then he turned and he went down Houston Street in the direction of the motorcade was to come. Right, now you say it said Jack Ruby. Did it say anything else besides Honest Joe and Jack Ruby? Yeah, it had tools, a lot of words like tools and other things on that order. Could you describe the car to me, or the truck to me? To me, it was just a black pickup truck, and it just had all this writing on it, and the writing was some white and some red, and it was on this black truck. Are you sure it was a truck? Yeah, I'm just positive it was a truck. And did you also see a car, maybe? No, I didn't see a car. I just saw this one truck that was in the direction of the motorcade, and we wondered why. Now, was this before the motorcade came or after? Before the motorcade came down. Did you see the truck anymore? No, not after he went down the street. He disappeared behind the building there, and I saw him no more. And how long after the truck disappeared did the motorcade come along? Well, it must have been, I say, about 15 minutes because it wasn't our lunchtime yet. We looking out of the window when we saw. Oh, you saw this from the window? Yeah, we were looking out of the window. This was before you came down onto the corner. Before we came down to lunch. And you saw it, and it said Jack Ruby and Honest Joe. Honest Joe Tools. Right. Okay, did you know Jack Ruby? No. Had you ever heard that, saw that name before? Never heard the name before and never had no connection with the president at all with Jack Ruby. All right, now after the incident with Ruby and Oswald, do you recall that you had seen it on the truck? Yes, but that's when we somehow know that was have connection. Right. In reference to the people that were standing on the corner with you, can you tell me again what their names were and if I know their addresses? I don't know because we don't work together anymore. We all work at different places, so I really don't know. I remember their names, but I don't remember their addresses. All right, have you seen any of them recently? Yes, I see Mrs. Van Zant, and I see Jean and Gertrude Fowler. Jean and Gertrude Fowler? Fowler. Would you happen to know where they live? No, because they moved lately and they bought a new home, and I don't know where. Are they still in the Dallas area? Yes, they are. I guess they are. They're in Oak Cliff, someplace in Oak Cliff. Okay, in reference to where you worked, can you explain to me where that building is in reference to the book depository? They're on Elm Street. The front of both buildings face Elm Street. Houston Street runs between the two buildings, and they each on the corner. Where I worked was 501 Elm Street. It was the corner of Houston and Elm. And across Houston Street, the book depository was right on that corner. All right, is that the building that is presently the Kennedy Museum? Do you know? I think they're going to turn it into a museum, yes. As I understand it, you worked on the 5th floor, right? In a dress or garment factory, right? All righty, incidentally, let me ask you, did you ever know a lady by the name of Lopez? Reply unintelligible. All right, did you know some of the people that were standing on the 5th floor with you? Yes, all my coworkers. Are they the same people that you named? Yes. All right, the owner of your, the supervisor or your employer's name at that time, can you tell me what that was? Yes, his name was Cupioli, Cupioli. This is within the Daltex building, people. Cupioli, Cupioli, Cupioli. All right, do you know if he's still in the Dallas area? Yes, he has a business. We moved from Elm Street. We moved to 1801 Lamar, and he's still there. Is that where he is now? 1801 Lamar. This is the second reference I've seen about people who are in the Daltex building moving to 1801 Lamar. So 1801 Lamar probably has some relevance. And that's in Dallas, yes. Now, do you remember some ladies working up there, possibly sisters and possibly Mexican or Spanish type people that worked in that building also on the 5th floor? Well, now, it was Spanish people there, but I don't know whether or not they were sisters. All right, okay. Now, as far as the building is concerned, when you look out of your window, you're looking at the side of the book depository, right? Right. The shipping area is back to your right, and the front door is to the left if you're standing on the 5th floor and looking out at the book depository. Is that correct? Yes. All right, I'm just trying to orientate you in the building. Were there many people at that window that you were looking out? Yes, we were all at the window. All right, and when you say all, how many are you talking? 5, 6, 10, more than that? It's more than that because more of us work there. I haven't called any of the white people that work there. There's a lot of those. All what I told you were black. Right. But there was a lot of white women working there. Now, this was before the motorcade came down. What was? Well, now, we saw the Jack Ruby's truck. Right. And while you were standing in the window, now, they weren't looking out then. Now we could stand at the window. Where we stood at the window and worked, we could look out the window. Oh, I see. You hadn't taken your lunch break yet. No, we wasn't on lunch break yet. Right. But we could look out the window and see his car, this truck. Do you have any idea what time you took your lunch break that day? At 12 o'clock. At 12 o'clock you went down? We didn't waste any time. We went down to get a position where we could see the president. Okay. When you saw this truck, did you think the truck, that was odd? We thought it was odd because there were no other cars on the street. Everything had been stopped by police. Everything, yes. Right. And then this truck came through. Did you see anyone get out of the truck? No, he didn't get out. Or anyone get in? No, he didn't get in. Now, is there anything else that happened at that time that you might think would be suspicious or caught your eye? No, there's just that one truck came down Elm Street, paused in the intersection for about 2 minutes, and then turned, went down Houston, and disappeared behind the building. Right. Now, when the motorcade came up Houston Street and before it, as it was making the turn in here, did one motorcycle man continue? Did you notice into this street? I didn't see. You didn't see anything? Okay. Let me ask you in reference to some photographs, as we talked a little earlier. As I understand it, nobody in your group that you know of took any pictures. No. Did anybody else that you know of take any photographs down there? No. All right. Other than what you saw in the newspaper, have you seen any photographs of that day and down there at that time? No. It's just only if it came out in the newspaper and, of course, the magazine that day. It came out in Life magazine. All of this whole thing came out in Life magazine. Okay, now were there any movie cameras, radio trucks, or television station trucks? Well, I didn't see anything. All right, how about in the book depository? Do you know anybody that worked in there? Yeah, well, not actually knew him. I knew Van Zandt. He's her cousin. All right, did you see him that date? No, I didn't see him. All right, did anything peculiar happen other than the president getting shot? Anything else happen on that corner in that area that you can recall? I don't think so. I don't know of anything ever than what actually happened in the president getting shot. Now, after all this was over and you ran upstairs back to the factory, you and your coworkers, and you found out the president was killed and everything, right? You all talked it over a little bit. Yes. Right. During that conversation, did anyone in that group or anything say they knew Oswald or Ruby? No, because those names we didn't know those names. After the names came out? No. When you discussed it after, what did y'all talk about? Naturally, we discussed why Ruby was there, but we didn't do this until after Oswald was killed. Right. I didn't understand that. Would you? Well, we discussed why Ruby wondered why he was there, but we didn't go into all this until after Oswald was killed. And then we had this connection between Oswald and Ruby. Other than that, we just thought he was down there looking like we were. All right. Did you see Ruby? I saw a man in a truck, but I couldn't identify him. He had on this dark gray hat. All right. And he was in the truck. All right, let me clear this up. Now you're saying you don't understand why Ruby was down there, but you're meaning that you don't understand why the truck was there, or you don't understand why the man was there. Because if you didn't know who was in the truck, you couldn't say Ruby was there unless you know Ruby. No, we didn't know Ruby, of course, but okay, but you didn't. You just didn't understand. But we assumed it was Ruby because he was driving a truck with Ruby's name and Honest Joe written on it, and we assumed it was Ruby, and we discussed this. At the time, you didn't know that the name didn't mean anything. But did you see that program on Sunday when Ruby shot Oswald? Yeah, I saw the actual when he actually shot him on television. Yes. Right. Now, the following day was Monday. You went to work, right? Yes. And that's when your coworkers and you discussed the fact that Ruby, the name Ruby, now meant something to you. Meant, yes, it did. And you and your coworkers discussed this, and you felt there was some connection by that truck being there. Yes, we did. With Jack Ruby's name on it and Oswald. Yes, Oswald wasn't in this picture now. He didn't get into the picture till after he got shot. Right, that's what I mean. But see, this is the following Monday. You're discussing this, right? Uh-huh. Did anyone in that group say that they knew or had ever heard of Oswald before? Or over the weekend spoke to anyone that knew Oswald? No, they did not. Or did they comment on the fact that there's a man that killed the president was working right across the street? Well, if they did, I don't remember. All right. And so, yeah, the rest of the interview doesn't seem like doesn't offer a whole lot, just wrapping this thing up. But that's pretty fascinating stuff, right? Pretty fascinating stuff. All right, let's move on to another interview. This is of a Mrs. Mary Hall. Mrs. Hall was interviewed at her sister's home. This is from the Select Committee on Assassinations. Mrs. Hall was interviewed at her sister's home and stated that on November 22nd, 63, she was employed by E. Willis Fashion Company, located at 501 Elm Street on the 5th floor. On the day prior to the president's visit, November 21st, two men came to the factory and had a conversation with Mr. Ralph Leeds, which she overheard, words to the effect that they were determining the route of the motorcade. Mrs. Hall was unable to state whom the men represented. On the morning of the 22nd of November, sometime between 9:30 and 10:30, Mrs. Hall states that she glanced out of the window. Her sewing machine faced Houston Street and was near the window, and observed an old type station wagon with writing on it saying Honest Joe, drive into Houston Street and parked next to the TSBD. A young man, whom she believed to be a delivery man, got out and took a package about 5 feet long and 6 to 8 inches wide from the car and entered the side door of the TSBD. At this time, Mrs. Hall states she resumed her work and didn't look out of the window until around lunchtime, when she looked across the street into the TSBD's 6th floor window. Their 6th floor window was level with our 5th floor window, and she saw a white male wearing a hat, apparently looking for something among boxes. She showed the man to her co-worker, Gertrude Fowler, and a few minutes later, they all went to have lunch and watched the president's motorcade. When the motorcade came by, Mrs. Hall states that she heard a bang. The president's hands went up towards his head, and a cop fell off his motorcycle. Another bang, and the president's head went over. Jackie got onto the trunk of the car. Everyone was screaming and running. Quote, I thought I saw smoke coming from the railroad. A lot of people ran to the railroad tracks, including myself, but we turned around and went back to work. At the factory, there were plainclothes police. I told Mr. Leeds about the man in the window across the street when I heard someone say that shots had come from the TSBD. Mr. Leeds told me to talk to the police and tell them what I saw, which I did. Later, we were all sent home. So interesting. She saw somebody get out of Honest Joe's car and walk up with a long package, 5 foot long, couple inches wide. I wonder what the implication of that is. All right. So here we have one last interview before I play an actual recording of Mrs. Van Zandt, another witness to Honest Joe. That's how we're gonna wrap up the show, with this recording. But this is a statement here from eyewitness Cleola Shields. Cleola Shields of Dallas, Texas, interviewed on November 22nd, 1963. Mrs. Shields was employed by Ed Wells Fashion, which was located at 501 Elm Street, 5th corner of Ellum and Houston Streets. At approximately 12 noon, Mrs. Shields and several co-workers came downstairs for lunch and to watch the presidential motorcade. Prior to the arrival of the motorcade, Mrs. Shields stated that she saw an auto driving around the plaza with writing on the body advertising Honest Joe's pawn shop. The auto left before the arrival of the motorcade. When the motorcade arrived, the president was waving and had just passed when she heard what sounded like a firecracker coming from the direction of the railroad crossing. The president's hand went up towards his head, and the car made a little pause and then took off. We all ran to the railroad trestle and looked into the boxcars. There was a lot of people looking in the boxcars. Also, police were there. We returned to work and were told to go home. So, another witness, saw Honest Joe's pawn shop vehicle pull into the area. So this was Cleola Shields. What we've gone over today, besides the articles, is the totality of witnesses who observed Honest Joe's vehicle. And based on the totality of what everyone says, it appears as though both of his vehicles were in play, and that's moments before the president's motorcade turned onto Elm Street, Honest Joe's vehicle had pulled up directly in front of the book depository and gone down the little road that connected to the parking lot behind the grassy knoll, right? And that it appears as though at least one of the vehicles did in fact have the .50 caliber mounted on it. So, what's the point of all this? The point of all this is that motherfucking Honest Joe was definitely involved in the assassination. He probably dropped off Valenti at the grassy knoll. And may he have been the one who delivered the rifles to the book depository? It's possible, I guess, right? This woman who is presumably uninvolved is giving a very neutral statement here. So, but that's going to do it for Honest Joe, okay? So, again, I just wanted to, spice up things before we get back, because tomorrow we're getting back into Lauren Hall, and we're going to be on him for, 2 fucking weeks. God damn it. At least 2 weeks. But that's how important he is in the assassination, that I'm willing to spend 2 fucking weeks on Lauren Hall. But here we go. I'm going to play this interview for you by Mrs. Van Zandt, who's the last witness who saw Honest Joe and his activities on on Main Street and in Dealey Plaza. So I hope you've been enjoying the content lately. I've been busting out a ton of content. Please pick up the fucking book. Okay, if you haven't bought the book yet, what the fuck's your problem? What are you waiting for? If you have any care about what happened to President Kennedy whatsoever, you will go to Amazon.com and you'll buy the book. Okay? And if you're really a broke-ass motherfucker and you really can't afford the $10 for a book, I don't know what to tell you. All right? That's it for today, guys. Enjoy this interview with Miss Van Zandt, and I'll see you tomorrow.
September 27th, 1977, at 2:35 p.m. We were in the home of Mrs. Irma Jean Van Zandt, 4409 Cinder Reed Lane, Dallas, Texas. Present is Investigator Clarence Day, Jack Moriarty, and Mrs. Van Zandt's husband, Joseph, and myself, Investigator Maxwell. The following will be the story of Mrs. Irma Jean Van Zandt. Miss Van Zandt, in your own words, will you tell us exactly what you saw?
Well, we come down about 12 o'clock that November the 22nd, and we were waiting for the motorcade. As we were standing there waiting for the motorcade, this car come up in front of the school book depository. It backed up and pulled up twice.
1 minute. Just prior to the car coming up, did something else happen?
Well, someone fainted over in the crowd over on Houston Street. And the police that was standing in the street went over to check on the crowd. Then an ambulance came up and picked up this person. I don't know whether it was a man or woman. And then, well, after this happened, then this when this car come up, backed up and pulled up in front of the school book depository. Then backed out into the intersection and left.
What did this car look like?
It was a car with a lot of writing on it, like Honest Joe Pawn Shop. It had a lot of signs on it. But I guess it was, something like, like riddles or little verses or something on it, but it had Pawn Shop and it had Honest Joe on it and it had this big sign on it.
And this Honest Joe is a pawn shop in Dallas, Texas at that time?
Yes, it is, on Ellum Street. And then minutes after the car left, then the motorcade came. And we were all standing there watching for the motorcade. And we waved to the president. And then a few minutes later, then I heard these shots, which I thought was firecrackers. Then I looked around and I saw everybody falling on the ground. Then I looked at my sister. And she said she had saw the president was shot. Then they speeded off and the Secret Service men ran towards the track. And I thought that's where the sound was coming from because it had an echo to the shots. So then after then I saw the police and this little boy come up and the little boy was showing them the window where the shooter was coming from. And that's all I can.
Now when you say we, you are referring to your sister and your niece and several co-workers whose names you've given me prior to recording this conversation.
Yes.
Right. I'll stop the tape for 1 second. The tape is starting again after approximately 50-second delay. All right. Mrs. Van Zandt, relative to the car, could you give us a little better picture as to how the car came in and what it was doing in that area?
It come from Houston Street. Come on across Houston, Ellum Street. And I can't call the name of the street, this other little street that runs to the back of the parking lot. But that's the way it comes. It come down Houston, across Ellum, into this little street that goes into the...
By the book department?
In front of the school book depository. I think the street leads to the parking lot back over there.
Yes, where it does.
Then it just paused in front of directly in front of the school book depository.
And one other point, when you say we were standing downstairs, could you be specific and tell us exactly practically where you were standing?
I was standing right on the corner of Elm Street, and I guess that's Houston runs straight on across. On the corner of Ellum in Houston. if it runs straight on across, if it goes on back down into this,
That would be to determine the northernmost part of the grassy knoll.
right directly on the corner.
And later on, talk this over with your sister.
Well, she talked to, she was telling us about it.
Right.
And then she told Mr. Lee. And Mr. Lee went down, and I guess he went down and got one of the men, and the man come up and talked to her.
Right. But now, you said, did your sister tell you that she saw someone in the book depository?
Yeah, she told me.
What did she tell you?
She said, I saw a man over in the school book depository, and she said he looked like he was running around and then looking for something or trying to hide something. That's what she said.
Did she say what floor he was on?
Well, it had to be the 5th floor because that's where we were, on the 5th floor. And we could look directly across the street, into these rooms.
Was this prior to the shooting or after the shooting?
After the shooting.
So after the shooting. After he returned to the building?
Yes.
Right.
Can you give me some idea as to time, how much longer after the shooting? I know it's been a long time, but just say was it right after the shooting, or was it 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes after the president
Well,
had
I
gone?
said it should be about 30 minutes.
All right.
Because we had 30 minutes off for lunch. And we went back upstairs. Well, it was probably about 30 to 45 minutes. Because we were just all upset and everything. And that's what she told me about. She saw this man.
Did she describe this man?
She might have. I can't remember right now. She said.
Do you remember Mr. Van Zandt?
No, she never told me.
All right. Now, getting back to the shooting itself. When, after what you believe were firecrackers and you determined it was a shooting, can you describe the action of the people around the area?
But everybody was running and falling on the ground. I guess they thought maybe the shooting would, they would get shot or something. They were just running, and some was falling on the ground, and some was running back towards the building.
Yeah. And what about the action of the Secret Service men?
But they all, at the time of the shoot, the ones I could see, could remember seeing, they all jumped off the car and ran towards the track, running.
The railroad track? Did you notice anyone run in or out of the book depository building at that time?
No, I did not. I didn't even look towards the school book depository because, just like I said, I thought the shots come from over that bottom. I never looked towards. Only time I looked towards the school book depository was when the police and this little boy come up on the motorcycle, and the little boy was pointing up.
Right.
He was just pointing up
When you
towards.
say the shots came from over the bottom,
I thought.
what do you mean by the bottom?
Well, the railroad track that goes to that terminal station over that, after go that underpass there.
Right.
But that's what I meant, the bottom, because, just like you hear a sound, look like to me, it would give this echo.
Oh.
So that's why I thought that it was coming from that way, that sound.
Let me ask you this. Did you think the shots came, I'm a little confused, did you think the shots came from in front of the president or behind the president?
In front of the president.
You thought the shots were coming from in front of the president.
That's what I thought it was coming.
Right. You have any questions yet?
Were you working at the depository at the time?
No, I just started to that. I take these models all over the place. I take
You believe you took Oswald's place?
Let me ask you another question. After this shooting took place, and being working on that corner there, right next to where the depository is, I'm going to ask you some things about the doors of the depository. The front door faces down Houston, and the doors that are around the side, I take it they were ramps where trucks backed up and all that. All right. Now, on that day, were those doors locked off or blocked off or something?
Well, tell you the truth, just like Joe said, I hardly ever pay attention to anything. But I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you whether those doors was open or what, because just like I said, I worked over there 7 years. And my cousin worked right next door to me, and I never even seen him.
Thank you very much. Tape is ending. You have something, Jack? Tape is ending at
What was it you started, practice started?
2:50 p.m.